I was reaching for a carton of milk when I saw him, standing under the flickering fluorescent lights, tapping his phone with the same restless impatience I had lived beside for 30 years. My hands went cold. The hum of the refrigerators grew louder, and the smell of stale bread suddenly made me dizzy because I was looking at the man I had buried. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt your reality crack in a single second, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this are closer to home than we admit. I remember the scuffed linoleum beneath my shoes, the rain streaking the windows, the way my heart refused to decide whether to stop or run. My mind searched for mercy, for a mistake, for anything that could explain why grief was suddenly standing 5 feet away, breathing. But he never looked at me. He turned, walked out, and took my certainty with him. That was the moment everything I believed began to unravel. 6 months after I buried my husband, I saw him standing in the canned food aisle of a grocery store, comparing prices like it was an ordinary Tuesday. My name is Margaret Hale. I am in my late 60s. I was married for more than 4 decades, and for half a year I had been learning how to exist as a widow. That morning, I was not thinking about grief or memories. I was thinking about paper towels, olive oil, and whether I had enough coffee at home. Ordinary thoughts, the kind you cling to when you are trying not to fall apart. Then my body reacted before my mind could catch up. My chest tightened. My hands went numb. There was a familiar way he leaned slightly to one side, the same posture I had watched across dinner tables and living rooms for most of my adult life. The curve of his shoulders, the back of his head, details so specific they felt impossible to mistake. The store smelled like disinfectant and baked bread. A cart rattled past me. Someone laughed nearby. Everything kept moving while I stood frozen, staring at the man I had mourned, prayed over, and laid to rest. My heart began to pound hard enough that I thought I might collapse between the shelves. I told myself it could not be real, that grief distorts perception, that memory plays cruel tricks. But one thought kept forming anyway, quiet and terrifying. If he was alive, then who did I bury? I told myself it had to be a mistake, that my eyes were filling in details my heart was desperate to see. Grief does that. People say. It blurs edges, rearranges memory, makes the impossible feel briefly familiar. I reminded myself of the long nights, the paperwork, the finality I had accepted. I reminded myself that I was standing in a grocery store, not in some dream stitched together from loss. My body still would not cooperate. My knees felt loose, like they might give way if I shifted my weight. There was a ringing in my ears that made everything else sound far away. I pressed my fingers into the handle of my cart just to feel something solid beneath my hands. I started inventorying memories the way I used to inventory shelves at home, the hospital call, the funeral flowers, the quiet house afterward. Surely a mind could not invent all of that and then undo it with one glance between aisles. I scanned his face again, searching for flaws, for proof of resemblance instead of identity. Men age into each other, I thought. Strangers share posture, gestures, habits. I tried to convince myself that familiarity was a trick of routine, not recognition. Around us, life continued without noticing me unravel. Someone reached past me for a can. A cart bumped lightly into my heel. I felt invisible and exposed at the same time. Then I noticed something else. The man shifted, subtly, as if aware of being watched. He angled his body away, just enough to create distance. It was not dramatic. It was careful. That small movement unsettled me more than the sight of him, because it suggested intention. And intention did not fit the explanations I was clinging to. For the first time, I felt denial loosen its grip, and something colder begin to take its place. I forced myself to slow down and really look at him, the way you do when you know your mind is trying to protect you from something it cannot accept. I stopped searching for reasons he was not my husband and started noticing the ways he was. There was the way he scanned the shelves, methodical and impatient, the same habit he had when he shopped with a list memorized instead of written down. There was the slight tightening of his jaw when prices caught his attention, a familiar irritation I had watched for decades. These were not general traits. They were specific, learned, lived. Then I saw his left hand. He reached for a can, and his pinky finger bent inward at an unnatural angle, just as it always had. Broken when he was a teenager, healed wrong, something he used to joke about when people noticed. My breath caught so sharply it hurt. No stranger shares a detail like that. No coincidence explains it. The world seemed to drop a few inches beneath my feet. My denial did not shatter loudly. It simply stopped working. In its place came a heavy, sinking certainty that pressed into my chest. I watched his face then. Really watched it. He avoided looking directly at me. He shifted again, more deliberately this time, angling his cart away, creating space, not confusion, not surprise, avoidance. That was the moment everything changed. This was not a mistake, not a cruel trick of grief. He knew I was there, and he was choosing not to be seen. A cold realization settled in. If he was alive and hiding in plain sight, then walking away would mean accepting a lie I could no longer carry. I stood there, heart pounding, knowing I was about to cross a line I could not uncross. I stood there for a moment longer, knowing exactly where the line was, and understanding that once I crossed it, there would be no returning to ignorance. Following someone feels wrong. It feels invasive. I told myself that if I turned away, I could still pretend this was none of my business, that grief had simply played a cruel trick and would eventually loosen its grip. But that logic collapsed under the weight of what I already knew. This was not curiosity. This was survival. I needed the truth the way a drowning person needs air. I kept my distance as he moved toward the checkout, my heart beating hard but steady, my steps careful. I watched him pay in cash, an odd detail that lodged itself in my mind. He declined any record of the purchase, a small choice that felt deliberate, practiced, the kind of habit you develop when you do not want a trail. When he pushed his cart outside, I waited before following, counting my breaths until my hands stopped shaking. His car was old, unfamiliar, nothing like the one we had owned. I memorized the license plate without thinking, as if some deeper instinct had taken over. Driving after him felt unreal. My body moved while my mind lagged behind, struggling to keep pace. The streets blurred past, familiar at first, then gradually unfamiliar, quieter. My shoulders were tight. My jaw ached from clenching. I told myself I could still stop, that I could turn around at the next light and go home, but I did not. Whatever waited at the end of this drive, I already understood one thing with certainty. My life had shifted, and there was no version of myself left who could look away. He turned into a neighborhood I had never seen before, quiet and modest, the kind of place you pass without noticing. I parked down the street and sat there with the engine off, my hands resting uselessly in my lap, my pulse loud in my ears. The house was small, painted a soft, careful color, a trimmed yard, toys near the porch. Nothing about it suggested secrecy or urgency. It looked lived in, settled. He stepped out of the car carrying grocery bags, moving with the ease of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Before he reached the door, it opened. A woman appeared, younger than me, relaxed in her body, familiar in the way she reached for one of the bags. She smiled at him without hesitation, the kind of smile that comes from repetition, not surprise. Then children spilled out behind her, running toward him without slowing, colliding into his legs like it was the best part of their day. He bent instinctively, steadying them, laughing in a way I had not heard in years but would have recognized anywhere. That sound hollowed me out. There was no confusion here, no hesitation. Every movement fit together cleanly, like pieces of a life assembled long before I arrived to witness it. This was not a detour. It was not a temporary shelter. It was a home. They went inside together, the door closing gently behind them, and I remained where I was, unseen and irrelevant. My chest felt tight, but no tears came. My body seemed to choose stillness instead, as if motion would break something beyond repair. In that moment, the past shifted. 6 months of grief rearranged themselves into something unrecognizable. The nights I had spent mourning, the emptiness I had learned to live inside, all of it collided with this quiet scene and fractured. I sat alone in the car as the light began to change, understanding with brutal clarity that my husband had not vanished from the world. He had simply built another one and left me outside it. I stayed there long after the house went quiet, long after the lights inside shifted and settled into evening. My grief did not explode. It rearranged itself. It became something colder, heavier, harder to name. For 6 months, I had lived inside mourning like it was a job I needed to do correctly. I woke up each morning and reminded myself that he was gone. I learned how to make coffee for one. I folded his clothes slowly before giving them away. I cried in predictable places, at predictable times, as if grief followed rules I could respect. Now those memories felt unstable, like furniture placed on a floor that was never solid. I realized how much effort I had spent surviving a loss that was not what I believed it was. How carefully I had carried pain that was built on a lie. My body reacted before my thoughts did. A dull pressure settled behind my ribs. My limbs felt heavy, as if gravity had increased without warning. I did not feel rage. I did not feel the relief people imagine comes with answers. I felt emptied out, hollowed by the understanding that my sorrow had been shaped by someone else's decisions. The quiet inside the car grew thick. Even my breathing sounded intrusive. I understood then that grief does not disappear when truth arrives. It changes its weight. It changes its direction. As I finally drove away, my mind began to drift backward, pulled toward earlier moments I had accepted without question. The hospital call, the days that followed, the funeral I stood through in borrowed strength. Details I had sealed away began to surface, asking to be examined again. When I think back to the funeral now, the memory feels altered, like a photograph that has been quietly retouched. At the time, everything seemed solemn and orderly. The room smelled of flowers and polished wood. People spoke in low voices. I moved through it as if guided, doing what was expected because grief had drained me of resistance. The casket was closed. I remember being told it was better that way, that the injuries were extensive, that this was an act of kindness. I did not question it. I trusted the calm authority of medical explanations and the gentle firmness of people who said they knew what was best. I told myself that love sometimes meant not looking too closely. Now that choice feels heavier. I realize how easily I accepted the absence of proof, how quickly I agreed that seeing him would not help me heal. I stood beside that sealed casket and never once asked to open it. I never asked for details that went beyond what was offered. Silence was presented as mercy, and I took it gratefully. In memory, small details begin to shift. The way paperwork was handled without discussion, the way decisions seemed already made before I arrived, how little space there was for questions. I had believed that this was what loss looked like, structured and contained. What unsettles me most is recognizing who stood between me and those unanswered questions. My son was there, steady and protective, helping manage arrangements, fielding information before it reached me. At the time, I saw that as care. Now I see something else forming beneath it. If there was anything I never saw, anything I was shielded from, he would know. And once that thought settled in, I understood where I had to go next. I went to my son early, before the day had fully settled, driven by a pressure that would not let me wait. He looked tired in a way that felt older than exhaustion, like someone who had been holding a position for too long. His concern met me immediately, gentle and practiced, shaped as reassurance. I felt him trying to steady me, to frame what I was saying as grief resurfacing, as confusion that needed to be managed rather than examined. I watched how he moved through the conversation without meeting my eyes for long, how he filled silences quickly, how his calm felt slightly ahead of my words, as if he already knew where my thoughts were headed. He spoke with care, but there was a distance in it, a careful narrowing that did not belong to comfort. I did not accuse him. I asked around the edges. I listened to what he skipped. I noticed the moment his body tightened when I returned to the funeral, to the casket, to what none of us had seen. There was a pause then, small but unmistakable. The air shifted. That was when I understood that he had never seen his father either. Not at the hospital, not at the funeral, not anywhere in between. The realization settled slowly, heavy and exact. My son had stood beside me in mourning without the certainty I assumed he carried. Silence did the rest of the work. His avoidance answered what his words would not. The fatigue I saw was not just grief. It was the strain of holding something alone. In that moment, hope drained away, replaced by a colder clarity. This was not new information to him. Whatever truth waited beneath the surface, my son had been living with it far longer than I had. And now, with nowhere left to place my questions, I could feel the next barrier beginning to crack. The truth came out slowly, not as an explosion, but as a controlled collapse. My son did not suddenly change. He simply stopped holding the line. The silence stretched, then thinned, and pieces began to surface in the only way they could, through what he could no longer keep contained. I understood, in fragments, how it had been planned long before the day I mourned, how my husband had been buried under a different name, a different life prepared in advance, how documents were altered, accounts shifted, money moved quietly and deliberately. There was no chaos in it. That was the most disturbing part. It was careful. It was patient. The body was not his. That realization landed with a weight that did not move. A stranger had died. Someone without family close enough to question what was done with him. That absence had been used. A sealed casket had made everything easier. Mercy, they had called it. Protection. My son had known enough to help, and not enough to stop it. Fear had shaped every choice he made after. Fear of losing his father permanently. Fear of the consequences if anyone spoke. Fear dressed up as loyalty, then as necessity. He had told himself he was preserving something, when in reality he was helping destroy it. I listened without interruption. I felt myself growing unnaturally calm, as if clarity had drained emotion out of the room. Each detail rearranged my understanding of the past months with brutal efficiency. The grief I carried had been engineered. The comfort offered to me had been a tool. What broke was not just the story of my marriage. It was the image of my son as someone untouched by this deception. In trying to protect me, He had decided I could not be trusted with the truth. In choosing silence, he had stepped into the damage alongside his father. When the last piece settled, I understood that I was standing in the aftermath of two disappearances, one deliberate, one irreversible. After the truth settled, the room felt emptier than it ever had after my husband's death. I realized then that I was grieving two different losses, and they did not weigh the same. Losing a spouse was an ending I had learned to survive. Losing a son, not in body but in trust, was something else entirely. With my husband, the pain had been sharp and public. There were rituals, condolences, a script for how widows are supposed to move through the world. This loss had none of that. It was quiet, almost invisible. My son was still standing in front of me, still breathing, still calling himself my child, and yet the version of him I believed in was gone. What hurt most was not the lie itself, but the decision behind it. He had looked at me and decided I was someone to manage, not someone to respect. He had carried the truth alone and convinced himself that silence was kindness. In doing so, he stepped across a line he could not step back from. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. Something in me withdrew instead, the way skin pulls back from heat. I understood that love does not survive unchecked betrayal, even when it comes from your own child. In that stillness, grief began to harden into something steadier. The mourning did not disappear, but it stopped owning me. What replaced it was a clear awareness that whatever came next would have to come from me. After that, there was a stretch of quiet where nothing new happened. No more revelations, no more words that changed the shape of the room. And in that quiet, I noticed something unfamiliar settling in. I was no longer waiting to be heard again. For months, grief had dictated my posture, my tone, my patience. Betrayal followed, and I stayed still, absorbing it as if endurance were the same as strength. But endurance has limits. Silence, I realized, was not something forced on me. It was something I had been accepting. That understanding did not arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. I could feel my thoughts slow and align. The questions that had been circling my mind stopped spinning and began to line up. Not questions of why or how could you, but questions that had weight and direction. What exists on paper? What was filed? What was moved, signed, transferred, hidden? I understood then that waiting for honesty from people who had already chosen deception was pointless. Truth was no longer something to request. It was something to verify. This was not about punishment or exposure. It was about reclaiming my own footing, about knowing where I stood in a reality that had been deliberately distorted. I felt steadier than I had in a long time. The grief was still there, but it was no longer steering. I was. And with that shift, I knew exactly what came next. I would stop listening for reassurance and start looking for proof. Once I stopped asking questions meant to soothe me, I started asking questions that could be answered. I went back through what I already had, slowly and without emotion. Bank statements, insurance paperwork, forms I had signed without reading closely because I trusted the man beside me. Patterns appeared almost immediately. Accounts that should have closed were still active. Addresses that did not match anything I recognized. Small, consistent transfers that made sense only if someone was still living, still spending, still planning. I kept going. I requested records I had never thought to request before. Death certificates, filing dates, identification numbers. Each document added weight, not chaos. The more factual it became, the steadier I felt. When I reached the edge of what I could confirm on my own, I did not hesitate. I asked for professional help, not to accuse, but to verify. People who worked with facts every day knew exactly where to look. They explained what I was seeing without drama, translating confusion into clear language. What emerged was not a theory, it was a structure, a trail of decisions that required coordination, foresight, and time, identity changes, financial continuity, legal maneuvers that only worked because no one expected a widow to question them. With every piece of proof, something settled inside me. Suspicion gave way to certainty. Certainty brought distance. Distance brought control. By the time I gathered everything together, there was no doubt left to wrestle with. I was no longer imagining betrayal. I was holding it in my hands. And once the truth is documented, it does not need to be argued. It only needs to be faced. I did not arrive angry. I arrived prepared. The house looked the same as it had the first time, ordinary and lived in, but I was different. I was no longer guessing. I was no longer hoping to be wrong. When he saw me, there was no confusion. Recognition came instantly, and with it, the failure of everything he had built. I did not raise my voice or demand explanations. I did not need to. The documents I carried said enough. Dates, names, accounts, records that align too cleanly to deny. Truth does not argue. It waits. I watched his face as the reality settled. Not fear, exactly, but the exhaustion of a lie that could no longer be maintained. The second woman stood nearby, trying to understand the shape of what was happening. I did not look at her for long. She was not my audience, but she was part of the truth. And truth has a way of reaching everyone in the room. There were moments of silence that felt heavier than words. In those pauses, I saw the collapse of the identity he had been protecting. The careful balance between two lives tipped, and there was nothing left to stabilize it. I felt no urge to punish him. That work was already underway, driven by consequences larger than me. My role was finished the moment the truth was revealed. I left without drama, without resolution offered or requested. As I stepped away, I understood something clearly. Once the truth is spoken, it no longer belongs to you. It moves on its own, and everything that follows is inevitable. Once the truth was exposed, events began to move without me. I did not push them forward, and I did not try to slow them down. Systems that had been blind before were no longer able to look away. Accounts were frozen and re-examined. Identities that had existed quietly for years were pulled apart by records and timelines. Legal processes took over with a precision that felt almost impersonal, and that distance was a relief. What followed was not chaos, but structure. Paperwork replaced secrecy. Oversight replaced control. Relationships collapsed in ways I did not witness directly. I chose not to monitor the fallout or wait for apologies that would not repair what was broken. I did not need to see consequences unfold to know they were real. Accountability does not require an audience. For the first time since this began, I stopped tracking outcomes. I stepped back from updates, from secondhand information, from the urge to confirm that justice was moving fast enough. That work was no longer mine. There was a quiet release in that separation. Not relief in the sense of happiness, but the easing of responsibility. I was no longer carrying the weight of truth on my own shoulders. What had to be exposed was exposed. What had to respond was responding. My role in reckoning was finished. In that clearing space, something else became possible. With the consequences set in motion, I finally had room to turn away from what was lost and begin rebuilding what remained. Rebuilding did not arrive as a moment. It arrived as a series of small, deliberate choices made day after day. I woke up at the same time each morning, not because I had to, but because I chose to. I reclaimed quiet routines that had once belonged to someone else's schedule and made them my own. I returned to spaces I had neglected. The kitchen became orderly again. The spare room stopped being a place I avoided and slowly turned into a place I used. I took walks without an agenda. I cooked meals that were simple and nourishing. None of it was symbolic at the time. It was practical. That practicality grounded me. I noticed my sense of self coming back in pieces. I was no longer someone waiting for updates or reacting to damage. I was someone deciding what mattered today. I remembered interests I had put down years ago, not out of sacrifice, but out of habit. I picked a few of them back up without pressure to make them meaningful. The pain did not disappear. It softened and settled into the background, no longer directing my movements. I learned that healing did not require forgetting. It required ownership of my time, my space, and my attention. Gradually, stability returned. Not the old version built on trust I did not verify, but a quieter one rooted in awareness and self-respect. I felt present again in my own life. From that steadier place, reflection became possible. With my footing secure, I was finally ready to look back, not to reopen wounds, but to understand what this experience had taught me and what might be worth sharing with others. When I look back now, I do not measure this chapter by what was taken from me. I measure it by what was clarified. Loss stripped away assumptions I had lived inside for decades and forced me to see where I had traded certainty for comfort. What remained was simpler and stronger. I learned that truth is not optional, even when it is inconvenient or late in arriving. I learned that dignity does not come from being chosen by others, but from choosing myself when it matters most. And I learned that self-respect is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, consistent, and non-negotiable. For a long time, I believed that age narrowed my choices. I see now that it refined them. Loss did not end my life. It redirected it. What I rebuilt was not a replacement for what I lost, but a version of myself that is more present, more honest, and less willing to disappear for someone else's comfort. If you are listening to this while standing in the middle of something you did not choose, I want you to know this. Clarity can still be ahead of you. Boundaries can still be drawn. It is never too late to insist on truth and still keep your humanity intact. Thank you for spending this time with me and for holding space for this story. If any part of it resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts or your own experiences in the comments. Your voice matters here.